This is Unsmashing the Stack, overflows countermeasures in the real world. My name is Sean Moyer. I work for a security consulting company in St. Louis called Speartip Technologies. These talks tend to be, this is my third one, and they tend to just be on something that I'm interested in and kind of obsessing about. So this is sort of what I've been obsessing about for the past year or so. We do forensics, we do assessments, we do a lot of IRDF, and so part of where this comes about is kind of my interest in going through and dealing with compromises and break-ins and thinking about some of the stack protection mechanisms. I mean, most of the time, whenever I'm dealing with a compromise, it usually starts with a buffer overflow of some kind in a network service. So, sort of the question of what can we do about that stuff. I like unsolvable problems, so I think probably more about defense. I think that the whole separation of attacker-defender is kind of pedestrian. I don't think it really is quite that simple. And actually, what I'll say is if you tend to be more interested in the attack side, a lot of what I went through in this talk in trying to kind of figure out how some of the protection mechanisms work, I also found a lot of things about attack vectors that people hadn't thought about. And that's, I think that's really the point, is a lot of these things do overlap. And there's sort of the two that kind of flow with each other. So I'm just a regular guy. There's a lot of really smart people at BlackHat. I'm not one of those people. This is, in particular, what I would say is I'm not an exploit developer. I've surprised myself in talking to people this year about this topic that I'm kind of able to hold my own, but, like probably the majority of people in this track, most of what I work on a day-to-day basis is the defensive side, and I've been in InfoSec for about 12 years and always been on the defensive side, so I found myself not really having to think a whole lot about the internals of a given vulnerability or how these things kind of work. Most of the time in the defense side, it's just, oh crap, we got a patch, we're all kind of scrambling to do that. And so with Vista and with some of the other things we're going to talk about overflow protection mechanisms that are kind of starting to come about in a lot of the different platforms, I wanted to kind of understand the effectiveness of sort of how they work. So yeah, pretty much I had an interest in this topic. One of the things that I found when I looked at this is that every paper I found and every talk that I found was either written by somebody who had came up with a way to defeat a given protection mechanism or somebody who was the author of a given protection mechanism. And of course, the people defeating it said that this was an ironclad attack, and of course the people writing the protection mechanisms always said that it was an unbreakable defense. So I'm kind of trying to see if there's some middle ground in there. Something that I mentioned in the paper is that the security industry as a whole, we've been on this cycle now for 10, 12 years where we've sort of applied the same model that the antivirus industry sort of perfected in the 80s, where it's about patches for sale on a subscription basis and going through and releasing signatures and patches and updates. And now, you've got the hot patch vendors doing some of the same things. But the question is, ultimately, what's kind of the root of the problem, and where does it, is there anything that we can do to address it more at the core and maybe get out of this sort of flailing death loop that we're in? So, what is this stuff? It seems like, in particular, kind of in the past few days when people ask me, like, what am I talking about, I've found myself saying exploit mitigation. At first I said pro-police ASLR, no exec stacks, and, people just looked at me. So, I think exploit mitigation is probably a pretty good term for kind of what this sort of series of different technologies do. The main intent of all this stuff is to make mass exploitation tougher to do. It's not necessarily about making something completely unbreakable, but at least, Mike Howard from Microsoft, who's one of the architects of some of this stuff in Vista, he calls it creating diversity. That you're trying to make things not so heterogeneous, homogeneous, where things are all kind of the same. I think a lot of people don't realize that most exploits are about kind of known configurations and known systems and being able to predict some of that stuff. And we'll get into more of that when we start talking about ASLR. Like I say, we're going to go over non-executable stacks and some of that stuff. address space layout randomization, canary values, some things about better organization for memory space, some of the things that you can do in compiler, and also look at some kind of other ways to approach this in terms of containment and things for exploits. So kind of starting at the beginning, does anybody know who these guys are? Somebody, come on. Allen and Gates. Yeah, so yeah, this is yeah, somebody said K and R. It's actually, I was looking for a picture of K and R, and I couldn't find one of both of them together, so this is Thompson and Ritchie. And I think Ritchie is the guy with the Phil Collins haircut. You know, he's always had like the kind of the bald on top and the long and back thing going on. But, you know, when we talk about this at a fundamental level, you know, when these guys came up with the C programming language and when we were initially kind of defining the architectures and the models that we use for computing, those are the 2 points into that system. That teletype, the other teletype. So when you're dealing with a bad actor or somebody who's, you know, a threat or an adversary, you can elbow the guy and say, hey, cut it out, Bob. You know, so it's a whole different problem than what we're dealing with now 30-odd years later. And actually, I was talking to somebody the other day about, has anybody ever messed with Core Wars years and years ago? If you like old stuff, you're a retro kind of guy. Core Wars was a game on some of the early Unix systems where you actually sat there with an adversary and played with like writing ASM instructions and then trying to stop the other guys. You know, and we're still playing Core Wars. It's just a little bit more complicated now. You know. So, you know, this class of bugs has probably been around longer than, you know, just about everybody in this room. Was anybody born before 1948? You don't have to raise your hand. You know, a lot of people will say it goes back to the 60s. I would actually, as I started trying to kind of understand the problem, something that I found actually in some previous e-documentation is they talked about the von Neumann model. And von Neumann was actually one of the guys from the Manhattan Project. Who was involved with UNIVAC and ENIAC and some of the early computer systems. And you know, in the very first systems, the way that you reprogrammed was to resolder. You know, you take apart a system and rewire it. And so von Neumann came up with a data code abstraction. So it was the idea of you have a series of instructions, and then you have data that you feed to, you know, an operating system, and then you deal with those instructions. Well, pretty much everything in dealing with overflows and memory corruption-based attacks is about jumping across that membrane and inserting data, unexpected data, that jumps across to the code layer. So what we're dealing with now with exploit mitigation in the last kind of 5-6 years is like trying to shore up that membrane and trying to kind of lock it down. So, you know, some of the old terms, you know, Fandango on core I really like. You know, I wish that would have stuck instead of buffer overflows. You know, I would have liked to have seen, you know, MSO4-27 Fandango on core and IIS, you know. But, you know, for whatever reason that didn't stick. I had to actually look up what a Fandango was, and I guess it's a Brazilian dance where there's like kind of a two-step that you do, so you're jumping from data to code. You know, something else I found was in Algol and Fortran and some of the early high-level languages. You know, they talked about dangling pointers and stale pointers, and of course, if anybody saw the talk yesterday, we're kind of now like just starting to wrap around that one. So, going back and trying to kind of understand, you know, where did this stuff start? Kind of the first remotely exploited buffer overflow was one of the two vectors that the Moore swarm took advantage of. So there was a stack-based overflow in Finger D, and the Moore swarm code actually, if you look at it, it's 99 lines of C, and it's you know, it has all the same principles that stuff still has now. You know, shell code and overriding pointers and redirecting execution flow. So it's kind of all the same principles. It's actually bug ID number 2 on Security Focus, which I thought was pretty cool. Somebody, whenever they were creating that database, kind of stepped back and said, "Okay, that's number 2. Number 1 is sendmail debug," you know, and that makes sense to me. So we're still kind of dealing with that one. Finger D is not in as wide use now, so we haven't sort of seen the same problems with it. The other thing that really was compelling to me is Spaff, Gene Spafford, who was kind of one of the first people to sort of define the InfoSec field and how this stuff works. He talked about bounds checking in C and said, you know, we need to avoid the gets call, the scanf call. We need to replace those with you know, sanity checking alternatives. And there's a whole section he's got in, basically that was kind of what he felt was the key problem with the Morris worm. So, the answer is we've known about this stuff. It's been quantified and defined for at least 19 years. So things were kind of quiet on the overflow front from about 88 to 95. If you look at the old bug track stuff back then, it was really just kind of, stupid developer tricks, like things like, really poor handling of login and authentication. I mean, I know if you look into like some of the old VAX bugs in the 80s, they were things like, hitting enter twice on login would drop you to an admin prompt, But once we started to fine-tune things a little bit and kind of shore up some of the really obvious stuff, we started looking at overflows. And Thomas Lepatic, who, if you look at some of the other things he did, he found some of the IIS bugs that related to NIMDA and some of the more widely exploitable 1990s stuff in IIS. He found a stack-based overflow in the NCSA HDBD. And if you read his post, he says, hey, this looks just like the Morris worm. And what was interesting about that and why that became sort of getting everybody interested in this problem is that this was as the public internet was starting to come about and we were starting to be interconnected. So these were no longer things that you could exploit on a local LAN. They were things that you could do from anywhere over the internet. And that's kind of really when things took off. Mudge wrote a paper that was a kind of a precursor to Aleph 1. We'll get to Aleph 1 in a second. That was an early walkthrough. He talked about constructing shellcode, NOP sleds, a lot of the same things that are still being utilized. Aleph 1, obviously, I'm assuming most of you have probably read Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. It still gets referenced. Like, one of the things that I found when I was trying to sort of understand this problem is that I couldn't find a single book that talked about exploitation that didn't reference that somewhere. And actually, something that I was impressed by now is that I found, just sort of like if you just Google for a copy of it, that there's a lot of university websites and a lot of professors are actually having their kids, their students walk through and write vulnerable code and understand how it's exploited. So, if the previous generation of developers had kind of had some of that exposure, maybe we wouldn't be sort of in the spot we're in today. Solar Designer in '97 was the first, and seems to be agreed upon to be the first example of return to libc-based attacks. This was actually, he was the author of one of the first no-exec stack implementations, and he, in discussing integrating that patch into the Linux kernel back then, actually, if you look through some of the threads, Linus Torvalds and some of the other guys said, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't really help you that much. There's still other vectors, and that he kind of got to thinking about how return to libc stuff works. So instead of exploiting something on the stack, you're targeting preloaded functions, things in memory. After that, probably the next leap in exploit development stuff and sort of attack approaches was the woo-woo paper on exploiting heap overflows. It was really interesting to me as I was trying to understand heap overflows that there's like a lot of discussion about it now. There's a talk at DC about it, and thanks for coming here instead, but there's the Soderov talk on the heap feng shui and JavaScript stuff. So it's still kind of an area of a lot of interest. So I had fun with it. I'm kind of a retro guy. I like kind of understanding some of this. For me, I was around and was kind of in the industry, but I was just getting my brain. I was a little kind of, somebody said, a little hackling, and I was just kind of starting to understand this when all these things were going on. So I liked, it made me feel better to kind of run back through some of this and realize, okay,